Welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping right into a really fascinating lecture by Ryuho Okawa, originally delivered back in June 2010. We're going to unpack some big ideas today, focusing on national management, economic philosophy, and what the author argues actually drives true wealth in a modern society. The text presents a pretty sharp critique of government policy by contrasting two very different visions of statecraft. We're looking at how nations are run, not just politically, but managerially. Now, if you've ever wondered how the underlying philosophy of a nation's leader can drastically alter its economic trajectory, well, you are in the exact right place. We're going to break down Okawa's arguments, map out the logic, and visualize exactly why the author believes certain economic philosophies lead to prosperity, while others send a country straight into a managed decline. Okay, let's dive right into this by posing the core question that really anchors the entire lecture. Does prioritizing the equal distribution of wealth inevitably lead to an equality of poverty? It's a heavy question, right? But this is the foundational hook of the text. The argument here is that when governments become overly fixated on making sure everyone has the exact same amount of wealth, they often end up destroying the very mechanisms that create that wealth in the first place. So instead of lifting everyone up to a higher standard of living, this approach essentially drags everyone down. The end result? A society where people are technically equal, sure, but they're equally poor. Let's see exactly how Okawa builds this case against redistribution-focused policies. To really ground this analysis, we're looking directly at Part 1, Chapter 1 of the June 26, 2010 lecture, which is titled Politicians with a Philosophy of Development and Prosperity. So, the crucial point here is how this text sets up a massive ideological clash. On one side of the ring, we have what the author calls materialism. According to the lecture, this view is rooted in outdated labor theories, where value is measured simply by the hours of physical work someone puts in. It's heavily focused on wealth redistribution, taking from the rich to give to the poor, and strictly enforcing inequality of results. But on the right side, we have the philosophy of development. This is heavily inspired by management thinkers, specifically Peter Drucker. This philosophy argues that modern wealth isn't about physical labor time at all. It's about applying wisdom, strategic thinking, and innovation to create massive new value. Basically, it's about growing the pie for absolutely everyone, rather than just slicing up a shrinking pie into perfectly equal pieces. The text puts it perfectly with this insight. Modern economics is not about how much coal can a miner dig in a day. It is about how to create massive value using wisdom, strategy, and software. Think about that for a second. The argument is that political leaders who still view the economy through the lens of industrial-era physical labor are just fundamentally unequipped to manage a modern knowledge-based economy. If your whole governing philosophy is based on counting hours of manual labor and redistributing the output, you completely miss the invisible, exponential value created by ingenuity, management, and technology. Now, Okawa takes this philosophical framework and applies it directly to a real-world political critique of the 2010 Democratic Party of Japan, or the DPJ administration. The author outlines some really severe grievances here. First, they argue the administration completely lacks any real management philosophy, specifically pointing out a total absence of Peter Drucker's principles of value creation. Second, their anti-bureaucrat stance is described as superficial. Basically, they're dismantling systems without knowing how to actually lead or manage the bureaucracy effectively. Third, the lecture claims their policies are rooted in political amateurism, meaning they just lack the necessary business acumen for statecraft. And finally, the text argues this administration prioritizes forced equality and social welfare at the direct expense of national productivity and economic growth. And this brilliantly illustrates the primary case study the author uses to highlight this alleged lack of management philosophy, which brings us to Section 3. Under the Khan administration, Japan's development is impossible. 2 million. That's the number the author cites to highlight the extreme dangers of this mindset. The administration had this proposed concept, a really radical policy vision, to intentionally shrink the population of Tokyo from a thriving metropolis of over 13 million people all the way down to just 2 million. The stated goal here was to forcibly decentralize the nation. They wanted to push people out into rural areas to achieve what they considered a more balanced or equal geographic distribution of the population and the economy. Let's walk through exactly why Okawa predicts this vision would be absolutely catastrophic. It's a brutal chain reaction. Step 1. To actually shrink Tokyo by 11 million people, the state would essentially have to mandate the forced eviction of millions of citizens from their homes. Step 2. By stripping the city of its workforce and its consumer base, you'd trigger widespread corporate bankruptcies. Businesses would just completely collapse. Step 3. With mass vacancies and no businesses, land prices in the capital would completely plummet, wiping out the wealth of property owners overnight. And step 4, the ultimate result is that Tokyo, which is a global economic powerhouse, would be downgraded to a rural economy. So in the author's eyes, this isn't a plan for balance at all. It's literally a blueprint for national destruction. To make this abstract idea of economic destruction a bit easier to grasp, the text uses a really vivid analogy. It compares this forced decentralization to taking the massive, globally competitive economy of California and intentionally dividing it up into small, isolated orange groves, just so everyone has their own little piece of land. I mean, sure, it might look a lot more equal on a map, but you're completely destroying the scale, the network effects, and the immense centralized power that actually allows the region to compete on the world stage. The argument is that by intentionally shrinking your economic center, you hollow out the entire nation's global competitiveness. Let's move on and see how this builds to a much broader and frankly darker warning from the author. This isn't just about bad urban planning. The text outlines 4 major dangers of trying to enforce equality. First, to actually guarantee equal outcomes, the government has to wield terrifying authoritarian levels of state control over people's lives and property. Second, it requires the constant, ongoing confiscation of wealth from anyone who is successful just to redistribute it. Third, this kind of environment fundamentally crushes outstanding individuals. It kills entrepreneurship and any incentive for innovation because success is basically penalized. And finally, the lecture argues that this hyper-focus on inequality of poverty inevitably results in the absolute death of freedom for the society as a whole. So what does this all mean? That brings us to the core tension we've been exploring today, summarized by one final question. Should modern political leaders act more like corporate managers focused on strategic growth and value creation, or like state planners focused on enforcing quality and redistribution? The 2010 lecture we reviewed today makes a fierce, unapologetic case for the former. It argues that without a philosophy of development, nations are literally just managing their own decline. It's a profound debate about the very nature of government, economics, and human potential. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. We hope these insights have helped illuminate the deep philosophical currents driving these critical political arguments. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will see you next time.
Welcome to today's explainer. We are diving into a truly fascinating, honestly kind of wild piece of source material today. We're looking at a text called The Next Frontier, and it has a highly unusual premise. Set right around June 26, 2010, this text presents itself as a purported spiritual dialogue with the father of modern management himself, Peter F. Drucker. Now, what's the goal of this dialogue? Well, it's to offer a sweeping, really sharp critique of Japan's political and economic landscape at that time, specifically taking aim at the policies of the Khan administration. And honestly, whether you look at this as a literal spiritual channeling or just a very unique literary framing device, the arguments it lays out are incredibly bold and absolutely demand our attention.
Just looking at the table of contents, you can instantly see how directly this text goes after the policies of the day. It uses this channeled perspective of Drucker to issue a really stern warning against easy tax hikes, actually calling them an infringement on property rights. From there, it makes this hard pivot toward the absolute necessity of nurturing future industries. So it's this comprehensive roadmap, half critique, half proposed solutions, all delivered through the lens of a legendary management icon.
To make sense of this wide-ranging dialogue, we've broken it down into 3 main acts. First, the economic critique. Second, the national strategy. And finally, a management masterclass. All right, let's jump right into Act 1, the economic critique, and specifically, this massive warning against the consumption tax. So, to set the stage, back in 2010, the Japanese government under the Khan administration was seriously looking at raising the consumption tax to deal with their economic problems. This text takes a completely hardline stance against that approach, offering a stark philosophical warning. The argument here is that easy tax hikes aren't just bad economics, they're fundamentally a coercive force. The text actually frames taxation as a direct infringement on the fundamental property rights of the citizens. It really challenges the morality of a government just casually dipping into the public's pockets without first exhausting every other avenue for efficiency and growth. To really hammer this point home, the author uses this striking extreme hypothetical. The text states, if you make the tax rate 100%, citizens will all die. Tax has that much coercive power. By scaling the idea all the way up to 100%, the author wants us to vividly realize that taxation isn't just, numbers on a spreadsheet. It's the state literally exercising the power of life and death, freedom and restriction over its people. Treating it casually, the text argues, is a very dangerous path.
So what practically happens if a government ignores that warning? The source maps out a very clear, highly destructive sequence, what it calls a vicious cycle. Step 1. The government implements that easy consumption tax hike. Step 2. This immediately suppresses consumption, resulting in lower purchasing power. People simply stop buying things. And step 3. That drop in demand triggers a vicious cycle of recession and unemployment. The takeaway here is that instead of saving the economy, a tax hike crushes the very engine of growth, leaving the entire nation worse off than before.
Okay, moving on to Act 2, the national strategy, specifically investing in the next frontier.
If raising taxes is the wrong move, what's the right one? Well, the text insists a nation absolutely must invest boldly in the future. And central to the strategy is this concept of future industries. The source explicitly defines these as sectors like aerospace and space exploration. But here's the really key distinction. You can't evaluate these as short-term business ventures. They require a massive state-level vision. The whole goal of investing in future industries is to actively elevate human civilization to its next stage, completely moving away from a mindset that only cares about immediate quarterly profits.
And this civilizational vision inherently ties into a global context. The dialogue argues that an advanced nation like Japan actually has a responsibility to the world. The point here is that wealthy, advanced nations can't afford to just play it safe domestically, or try to survive by just making their products a little cheaper. They have a duty to pioneer these future economies. They need to lead the way in technological advancement and act as a literal engine for global progress. Now, you might be wondering, okay, but aerospace, space exploration, that sounds unbelievably expensive. Well, the text addresses that head-on by citing a truly staggering figure, 1.4 to 1.5 quadrillion yen. That was the estimated national wealth, the financial assets held by citizens in Japan at the time. So the crucial argument here is that the problem isn't a lack of money. The money is literally sitting right there. The problem, according to this dialogue, is a complete lack of a grand national strategy on how to effectively mobilize and invest that massive wealth for the future. And the ultimate manifestation of that grand strategy? Space development. The source argues that when a state invests in spacecraft, they shouldn't be asking, how much profit will this make next year? That is entirely the wrong lens. Instead, state investment in space is about achieving the absolute highest technological standards available to humanity. By reaching for those extreme heights, a nation subsequently pulls all of its other domestic industries upward along with it, allowing it to lead the world both economically and technologically.
Which brings us to our third and final section, the Management Masterclass. Let's talk about empowering the individual.
To actually pull off these massive national goals, you need organizations that function well on a micro level. The text draws a really vivid contrast between two styles of management to illustrate this. On one side, you have the outdated vertical or army-style organization. Think rigid, top-down, strictly following orders from the hierarchy. It's great if you need to move massive groups of people uniformly, but it is terrible for innovation. On the flip side is what the text fiercely advocates for, the soccer or orchestra style. This is all about dynamic teamwork where specialized individual strengths are harmonized to achieve a unified goal.
The source points out that politics, and honestly a lot of traditional organizations, often default to that rigid army style. But modern challenges require a soccer team approach, or an orchestra approach. Think about a soccer match. Yes, players have assigned positions, but the game is incredibly fluid. A defender might suddenly need to attack, a forward might need to drop back and defend. It's exactly like musicians in an orchestra harmonizing their unique instruments. The team has to dynamically adapt to this situation in real time, relying on the unique skills of each player, instead of just waiting around for a rigid order from the boss.
So, how do you actually cultivate that kind of flexible management? Well, the purported spirit of Drucker offers some highly actionable advice, particularly aimed at the younger generations who are going to be leading the future. First up, organizations have to promote based on merit and capability. You've got to boldly discard those strict seniority systems. Second, leaders must actively listen to the ideas of younger members. Having a listening ear is absolutely vital. Third, individuals need to put in the mental work to overcome internal jealousy within the team. And finally, the ultimate goal is to maximize everyone's unique shining points, even if they seem totally average in other areas. And this leads us to the absolute core message of the entire management section. The text states that the true nature of management is simply this: finding and utilizing the greatest strengths of individuals. If you try to make everyone on your team perfectly well-rounded and average, the overall power of the organization actually drops.
True management is identifying exactly where a person shines the brightest and deploying them specifically in that role.
We have covered a ton of ground today, from a highly unique critique of economic stagnation and tax hikes to a bold call for civilizational investment in space to a masterclass in dynamic, strengths-based management. The insights from this purported dialogue with Peter Drucker really challenge us to think so much bigger than our immediate circumstances. So I want to leave you with this to ponder. How can you move away from rigid hierarchies and apply that soccer-style management to your own teams? And looking at the world right now, what are the bold future frontiers that our societies desperately need to be investing in today? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.
All right, let's jump right into today's explainer. We're looking at a deeply unconventional text by Ryuho Okawa. Specifically, we're diving into Part 2, recorded back on June 29, 2010, focusing on Chapter 3. The big topic here? The complex relationship between a nation's defense spending and its overall economy. You know, every major country wrestles with how wealth and military power intersect. But while most standard analyses just stop at budget numbers, this source material takes us on a pretty wild journey. We go from straightforward economic theory to a highly spiritual, really unexpected take on modern geopolitics. So, if you like exploring thought-provoking frameworks that totally challenge the status quo, you're definitely in the right place. Now, the author grounds this whole complex discussion with an incredibly simple metaphor. They write, deterrence is about making sure a thief cannot enter. It's great because it cuts right through all that dense political jargon we usually hear. We hear the word deterrence thrown around all the time in international relations, but at its core, the text is saying it's literally just like putting a heavy lock on your front door. You don't buy a lock because you want to get into a fight, right? You buy it so that anyone looking to steal what you've built decides it's just not worth the hassle. It's about securing your hard-earned wealth.
So, to unpack all of this, we're going to cover three main areas today. Number 1, the economic logic. Number 2, the international reality. And finally, number 3, the spiritual perspective. Let's get into it.
Starting off with Section 1, the economic logic, and looking at deterrence as a security guard.
So, the really crucial point here is how the author tackles a common economic contradiction. You often hear people ask, hey, if a nation wants a small government, lower taxes, less state intervention, doesn't that mean they have to slash defense spending too? Well, the author explicitly argues no. In fact, they say these goals are entirely compatible. According to the text, a booming economy absolutely requires a safe environment to function. Defense isn't just some bloated government program. It's the fundamental prerequisite that allows a free market economy to actually exist without being dismantled by outside forces.
To really hit the nail on the head, the author uses this brilliant analogy of a small 100 yen shop. A little shop like that operates on a pretty small scale, right? Sure, a thief might wander in occasionally, but for the most part, the shop can rely on the general goodness of people. Hiring a full-time, expensive security guard just wouldn't make economic sense. But, the author argues, a nation with a massive GDP is a completely different story. A high GDP country is essentially a giant bank vault. It holds so much concentrated wealth that it becomes a prime target on the global stage. Because of that immense risk, it absolutely requires the heavy security guard of military deterrence. Basically, the sheer scale of your wealth dictates the scale of the defense you need.
Moving on to Section 2, the international reality, where we'll look at diplomatic voice and trade.
Looking at how this plays out in the real world, the text uses Japan as its main case study. For decades now, Japan has been this massive economic powerhouse, right? They consistently pay huge financial dues to the United Nations, historically ranking as the first or second highest contributor in the world. And yet, as the author points out, Japan continually struggles to secure a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. The source material argues this is the direct result of neglecting defense. Despite having all this immense wealth, lacking credible military deterrence drastically lowers a nation's voice and diplomatic leverage in the international community. The takeaway here is that money alone simply does not buy true geopolitical influence.
But it goes deeper than just UN seats. There's a real cascading effect on the economy. The author argues that military deterrence is absolutely vital for guaranteeing fairness in international trade. Without it, you just can't ensure mutually beneficial outcomes. To prove this point, the text points back to historical colonialism, specifically the trade relationship between Britain and India over a century ago. The author notes that because India lacked a comparable military defense, the trade became this one-sided wealth extraction. It left India impoverished while Britain grew massively wealthy. So the stark warning is, without that lock on the door, international trade can quickly devolve into systemic exploitation.
And that brings us to Section 3, the spiritual perspective.
This is where we look at geopolitics and spirits.
Now, this is where the explainer takes a highly unconventional turn. The author introduces a spiritual element, claiming to channel the spirit of Adam Smith. Yes, the famous 18th century father of modern economics. Through this spiritual perspective, the text shares a warning from Adam Smith that Japan, or really any wealthy but underdefended nation, must establish true self-reliance. The message here is that if a country relies solely on its economic output, but lacks the independent strength to actually defend it, it risks basically becoming a colony. The channeled warning is that without a strong defense, all that hard-earned wealth will just be absorbed by foreign powers.
Applying the spiritual lens to modern superpowers, the text makes a really striking claim about China. Conventionally, we look at Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening policy as a shift toward free markets to, improve the lives of everyday citizens. But according to the channeled spirit in this text, that economic liberalization had a very different ulterior motive. The source argues that the true calculated aim of the reform and opening was specifically to generate massive national wealth for the explicit purpose of funding aggressive military expansion. In this view, economic integration wasn't about domestic prosperity. It was actually a strategic tool for military dominance.
Which brings us to arguably the most provocative claim in the book's spiritual analysis. The author introduces this concept called the law of same wavelengths. It's this idea that similar minds and intentions naturally attract each other across both the physical and spiritual realms. And through this principle, the text asserts that the spirit of Adolf Hitler is naturally drawn to and is currently approaching the Chinese leadership. The author states this is happening because the leadership's heavy pivot toward military expansionism is operating on the exact same psychological and spiritual wavelength as historical totalitarian aggression.
So, synthesizing all of this, there is obviously a vast difference between standard geopolitical thinking and the unique thesis of this book. On one side, the conventional viewpoint assumes that a nation's economic rise naturally leads to peaceful global integration, driven purely by material policies. But on the other hand, the book's spiritual viewpoint argues the complete opposite. It suggests that an economic rise can just be a strategic front for military ambition, and that global events are actively being influenced by the spirits of historical figures. It's a framework that really asks you to look at modern defense not just as a matter of spreadsheets and policy, but as a reflection of underlying spiritual intentions.
And that brings us to our final takeaway for today. Whether you're looking at this through the practical lens of a security guard protecting a shop, or through these highly unconventional spiritual warnings, the source material really forces a critical evaluation of a nation's priorities. You simply cannot separate a country's bank account from its physical security. So, having gone through this analysis, I want to leave you with a question to chew on. How do economic security, military deterrence, and fundamentally unique ideological perspectives shape the intense foreign policy debates we're seeing in our own nations right now? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating explainer with me, and keep questioning those deeper layers of the global stage.
Welcome to today's Explainer, where we are going to unpack a truly wild and fascinating source text. We're looking at a document from June 29, 2010 that frames modern geopolitical and technological issues through, well, a pretty unconventional lens. It's presented as a spiritual dialogue with none other than Adam Smith, the famous founder of modern economics. Now, whether you're deeply familiar with classical economics or just kind of curious about how an 18th century philosophy might apply to today's world, this text offers some seriously thought-provoking perspectives. It literally takes Smith's classic theories and projects them straight onto 21st century dilemmas. So let's dive right into this text, focusing specifically on Chapter 4. The author uses this dialogue format as a really unique mechanism to critique current global events and makes some incredibly bold predictions about our future. It's a deeply curious framing device, right? Bypassing your standard political commentary by invoking the perspective of the ultimate classical economist. We're going to neutrally explore the ideas presented here to really understand the text's core arguments. To make sense of all these wide-ranging predictions, we're breaking things down into 5 quick sections today. First, the dialogue with Adam Smith. 2, space, the next frontier. 3, China's decade of crisis. 4, Japan's path to survival. And 5, the invisible hand today. Okay, kicking things off with Section 1. Dialogue with Adam Smith, a modern lens. Now, you already know the famous classical concept of the invisible hand, but what's so interesting here is how radically the text reinterprets it. Instead of just applying it to individuals buying and selling goods, the author expands it to the unstoppable flow of digital information and even humanity's cosmic expansion. The argument is that this unseen force of progress is so fundamental that governments absolutely cannot suppress it without facing severe consequences. Moving right along to Section 2, Space, the Next Frontier. The dialogue presented here explicitly compares the push for space development to humanity's built-in drive for freedom and movement. According to the text, it is literally human nature to explore the unknown. Just as ancient peoples migrated and crossed oceans to seek out better lives and new resources, the text argues that expanding into space is the natural, completely inevitable next step for elevating our civilization stage. And they make a direct historical parallel here, comparing the massive economic potential of modern space exploration to the voyages of Columbus and Magellan. Think about it. When those explorers first set sail, people back home probably questioned the immediate economic benefit, right? They likely asked, what is the point of sailing west to find India? Yet those voyages opened up entirely new eras of global trade and wealth. The source argues that space holds that exact same potential for us today. It is essentially our modern age of discovery. So the crucial point the text is making is that space development shouldn't just be some side project. It needs to be a primary, overarching national goal that will yield massive economic dividends down the line. The text is actually pretty critical of short-term government spending, comparing it unfavorably to, say, planting trees of gold for the future. By investing heavily in aerospace and robotics, a nation doesn't just go to space, it creates entirely new sectors of employment and technology right here on Earth. It's very much analogous to the huge economic ripple effects we're seeing from the push for Mars exploration in the 2030s. Let's shift gears to Section 3, China's Decade of Crisis. The text posits that a decade of crisis is kicking off in China, mainly because the intense friction between rapid economic growth and a strictly controlled political system has finally hit a breaking point. The author's stance is that you simply cannot maintain a massive, dynamic economy while simultaneously trying to micromanage and control every single aspect of it. Eventually, the sheer weight and natural flow of those economic principles will overpower totalitarian constraints. And according to the dialogue, a major catalyst for this impending crisis is a brand new, totally unexpected trial for the regime: cell phones. The text points out that while state-run media might broadcast a highly controlled, curated narrative, everyday citizens are quietly building an entire underground economy of information. Through mobile networks, regular people are texting and sharing the actual truth about the economy and current events, completely bypassing official channels. The text predicts a very specific sequence of events here. Step 1, undeniable national economic growth enriches the population. With that new wealth comes Step 2, the widespread adoption of technology, specifically mobile phones. This leads directly to Step 3, which is the uncontrollable spread of underground information. And finally, the invisible hand, that unstoppable force of human exchange and desire for truth, steps in to trigger systemic change. The text even suggests this could culminate in a peaceful revolution, simply because the state can no longer suppress the economic and informational reality of its own people. Now let's look at Section 4, Japan's Path to Survival. The dialogue takes a pretty sharp pivot here, arguing that a government run entirely by bureaucrats totally stifles the creativity, wisdom, and ingenuity of everyday citizens. True prosperity, the author argues, naturally bubbles up from the bottom through market creativity. You can't just mandate it through top-down administrative control. And to get specific, the text sharply criticizes the Khan administration's domestic landscape. It specifically targets their stated goal of a minimum unhappiness society, along with their heavy focus on national debt and tax increases. The author views this as a fundamentally pessimistic, shrinking view of what a nation can be. Instead, the dialogue argues that Japan's true path to survival means aggressive investment in the future. It's about driving continuous technological innovation and constantly creating new value, rather than just nervously managing a decline. Wrapping things up with Section 5, the invisible hand today. The overarching takeaway from all these pages is pretty clear. Trying to suppress economic realities or failing to invest in grand future visions will inevitably lead to systemic failure. Whether it's a government trying to put a lid on the smartphones of its citizens, or an administration focusing entirely on debt rather than technological frontiers, the end result is stagnation. True growth, the text argues, requires actually trusting the invisible hand, trusting human ingenuity, the free exchange of ideas, and the bold pursuit of whatever lies next. As we finish up this explainer, I'll leave you with this thought to chew on. Whether you completely agree with the text's predictions or view them simply as a really unique philosophical exercise, the core question it raises is super powerful. How might the unseen forces of economics, human desire, and information exchange silently be dictating the very next chapter of human history right this second? It's definitely something worth considering. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning the forces that shape our world.